I have a great privilege of working with loads of people and loads of organisations who work on food and farming, and it's been my obsession for the last 25 years. So I'm not going to try and do an entire download of that, but it's so nice to see all of your faces on the screen and to be part of this conversation. So Sustain is an NGO, a campaign organisation, an advocacy group. I'm sure you've heard a joke often in food events where people say, I wear lots of hats. Well, we really do wear lots of hats, because we have to reinterpret talking about food and farming to whoever will listen, because food and farming crosses over everything. So we are talking to government, we're talking to local authorities, we're talking to communities, and I sometimes draw a sort of diagram that's a bit like an hourglass, in that advocacy groups and campaign organisations can be speaking up to government and helping to channel policy and money out to communities, but we can also be speaking with communities about what is needed locally. And I mean communities not just in terms of people who live next door to each other, but people who are in communities of practice like farming as well. And to say, what do we, they, us need in order for the right flows of both information and money and policy to be happening in a way that will create a better system for food and farming. As your wonderful questions at the beginning illustrated rather well, there's all kinds of things that are very, very wrong with our food system, and we haven't yet, as a species, sorted out our ecological relationship with food. I often think on the spiritual side, and I'm quite influenced by Miles, we meet up once a year for a lovely meal at the Oxfordville Farming Conference. So nice to see you, Miles, even in lockdown, yay. We often talk about the idea of how, well, eating is our fundamental relationship with the planet. It's not just a technical relationship in terms of how much food we can get out of the soil, but it's also, we actually consume the planet and our world, other animals, plants, and the way that is created is part of our health, and we are totally dependent on an ecological system and pollinators and healthy soil and clean water, and somehow our species forgot that somewhere along the line, or maybe at the scale that we do it have only just begun to realize quite how important that is. I recently went to a birthday party of Friends of the Earth and realized I was roughly the same age as it, and that was quite scary. The idea that only in my own personal lifetime have people being started to talk about these issues seriously and to put them on a political footing and a campaign footing. So I feel like an inheritor of a lot of those movements over the years. And now I started volunteering for them 20 years ago and have now ended up running an alliance of lots of people who are doing this flow of information. But what I'm particularly obsessed by is how do we turn that knowledge and that awakening and those insights into real change. I'm less interested in talking about it theoretically anymore. I really, really want to go at it with what specific thing can we change. So Miles and Vicky, who would apologise for not being able to be here, she's unwell, we work very specifically on changes to legislation, funding, policy, what's banned, what's allowed, farming practice, how do species get looked after, how does soil get looked after. And it still feels, even after all these years, that we're still only taking baby steps to really taking a much more systemic approach to looking after the planet that is fundamentally looking after us. So about the way we feed our children, the way we bring about education, the way we manage pesticides, the way we look after pollinators. And I don't mean to be too, what do I mean, productionist about that or too mechanical about that. I do mean about fundamentally the intrinsic value of this miraculous planet that we live on. And I'm really very grateful to yourselves, to Extinction Rebellion, for having pushed this so far up the agenda. It also, and I absolutely guarantee this, it makes the political space in which we can be having arguments in government. So I go into a lot of meetings with people like DEFRA, with Pesticide Safety Directorate, and all kinds of sort of technical people talking about very specific things that can be done. And literally outside the window a few times, there's been an Extinction Rebellion protest happening outside the window. And I'm so grateful for that, because it raises the temperature. And it raises the kind of human presence in that room rather than the technical presence. This is about our future, about how we would like things to be. And I'm very much with Miles that it isn't just a technical question. This is also about our spiritual relationship with the planet, a non-exploitative relationship, but fundamentally how we'd like lives to be. How do we want to be as human beings? Do we want to be endless consumers and destroyers, or do we want to be creating a wonderful thing about food is we can create a wonderful supportive, kind, healthy future in which it is fun to have relationships, and food can be really fundamental to that. You know, there you go. You want some things that have been obsessing me for the last 25 years? There is a small treatise on them, and I'd love to hear from Miles in that context as well.
I think, I mean, I agree with all of that. I think we should be quite, as a movement, not personally, but as a movement, I think we should celebrate what we have achieved over the last 30, 40 years. Things have changed hugely. Back in the early 80s, amazingly, we had reached, as a country, we'd reached 90% self-sufficiency in food. That, for some people, that was a glorious success, but what it caused was untold environmental and social destruction. And partly as a result of the work of Friends of the Earth, the Soil Association, and everyone else, we've succeeded in reducing the level of self-sufficiency. It sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? We've succeeded in reducing our self-sufficiency, and in doing so, we've created more space for other things to come back, including, you know, wildlife, including people. But it is extraordinary when you think about it that 84% of the UK is either under farmland or forestry. It's an enormous amount of land. Most of Britain is either under farmland or forestry, and it's easy to forget that or not to realise it. So the choices we make about the food that we buy have a profound effect on the way that the land is managed, that the country is able to look after the wildlife that has always lived there, or not. And that is an individual choice. We have to have, it's like we have to have food every day. It's the one thing that we have in our lives every day, day in, day out, that links us to nature and to the environment more broadly. So each of us really can make a difference to through the choices we make to the future of the environment and nature, and indeed the climate. So that's where I sort of start from. I think we should celebrate successes that have been made, but there's still a huge amount to do yet.
Miles, I wonder if I could ask you, you know, you were talking earlier about, before we came on the call, about the land use in the UK. I just wonder if you've got any thoughts about how you would like that to be, and you know, how it currently is.
Have you got that graphic I sent you, Phil, on land use? So agriculture, this is at England rather than for the UK, but it's very similar, and it does give an idea of just how dominant agriculture is. And a lot of that agriculture is quite intensive, or indeed very intensive. About half of it is arable land, and that land is used to grow crops like wheat and barley, oats, and a relative newcomer, which is maize, which I'll come on to a bit later. And the other half is grass. And most of that is literally one species of grass, perennial ryegrass, which is grown to feed cattle, beef cattle, dairy cattle, and sheep. So you've got this one species of grass which has become super dominant across half of the entire agricultural landscape of England, replacing all sorts of other fantastic wildlife habitats in its path. And from an agricultural perspective, that's been hugely successful, because that means you're growing more animals, because this one grass is more nutritious than all the wild flowers and all the wild grasses that it replaced.
I think it would be good to think about those changes that you would like to see happening. And I wonder if, Kath, you want to come in a bit about talking about that.
This is a fascinating area, because all that Miles has been talking about is absolutely fascinating. And I'm not going to talk about really self-sufficiency as such. I'm very influenced by a lady called Julie Brown, who is the chief executive or manager of a vegetable box scheme in East London called Growing Communities. And I really recommend hanging out in their website for a bit and seeing the stuff they do, because it's not just a fruit and veg scheme. I'm a volunteer member of the trustee group, but I'm a mate of Julie's for over 20, 30 years. What she's done is created a food systems approach to provisioning ourselves that takes into account ecology, agroecology, farmers' incomes, good livelihoods, relationship, fairness, all sorts of things. I mean, if you ever get a chance to, I'll circulate, if you like, actually, a link to a talk that she did recently. It was very good. But she has lived out in practice a land use strategy, weirdly, as well, because she has said, we aren't going to be self-sufficient in absolutely everything, and there are better places to grow some things than in other places, and we wouldn't want to be eating kale all year round. Well, actually, I'm very fond of kale, but not everybody does that. And if you could persuade my 5-year-old to eat kale, that would be amazing. Anybody who can manage that would be great. But so it is a really balanced approach to provisioning. It is about, and it's never too black and white as well. It's about saying mainly plants. So fruit and vegetables are absolutely the priority. At the moment, as you've seen from the statistics here, that the fruit and veg are not a priority in terms of production, and they're not necessarily produced in an agroecological way by means of which that we're supporting wildlife and clean water and all those things. And we're not trading it fairly, and there's a lot of waste because we have cosmetic standards that are too high, and we aren't seasonal about the way we look after ourselves in terms of fruit and veg. So Julie's buying strategy is to make sure that fruit and veg are given primacy, and that those are from agroecological farmers. And she uses this kind of not a food miles diagram, but a food zones diagram. She says the most perishable produce should come from as close as possible, because you lose loads basically if you have to handle it a lot. And having it as close as possible so it's as fresh as possible, that means you can also have diverse crops that are very good for pollinators, blah, blah, blah. All sorts of things come from that. You then look at robust things like root vegetables from further afield, because actually further afield, pun intended, further afield fields might be more suitable for growing robust crops like potatoes, turnips, beetroot, all those kind of things. And then we will trade, of course, with other people, with our European neighbours who we're about to cut ties with. You know, actually a very good source of year-round wonderful fruit and veg. What I found fascinating is that the very fair, it's £1 million turnover, by the way, this is not a small veg scheme, and she's also mentored lots of other people around the country to run this kind of scheme, because fairness is built in right from the start, and mixed farming, which is very important, talking about land use strategy, and a relationship across the seasons, not just buying in strawberries at one for a few weeks of the year and then leaving those farmers and their workers to their own devices. She's dealing with mixed cropping farmers, so they can offer jobs all year so that they are decent jobs. So those farmers in the box scheme have not had the problems with labour and cropping and planting that other farmers have had in the UK, because it is built into a fair system that works for the trading and everything. Now, of course, it's one box scheme in East London, Hackney, where I'm sitting right now. But if that was replicated everywhere, there would be better jobs in farming, and we would be supporting loyally, as me as a customer, not just a trustee of it, but me as a customer is loyally supporting farmers to make it through crises. Well, the everyday crisis on farming is about income. The everyday crisis on farming is about labour, and it is about the practicalities of getting fruit and veg to market. We expect small-scale mixed farmers to be good at everything. We expect them to be good at water management, crop management, livestock management, marketing, distribution. How do we make the livelihoods in looking after our land viable livelihoods? And that's not just about shopping our way out of the problem. It's about designing the trading systems that support the right kind of stuff on farm. And it's also about how do we subsidise behaviours as a nation on the farm through our farm payment systems. And it's one of the things I'm sure we'll come to in a moment about, you know, leaving the European Union. We are taking back control, sorry to use that phrase, but taking back control actually of a lot of our agriculture policy. And what does that look like when you're asking farmers to change behaviours to be pro-pollinator, pro-clean water, looking after biodiversity, and not just putting in the odd pond here and there, actually fundamentally saying, how do we cultivate biodiversity and clean air and clean water at the same time as creating food? And a lot of that will be a bit like Julie's principles. It'll be about more fruit and veg. 1% of our land is for fruit and veg. How much more of it would be needed if we wanted to feed ourselves a healthy diet? Well, actually, we started doing that calculation, and it's not that much more, actually. It's not that much more. But it could be providing really good jobs close to where people live. Really good jobs that would be compatible with family life, that could be linked to local schools and local trading outlets. You know, if we're going to build back better, could build back better involve quite a lot of fruit and veg, please? I would quite like that, and especially if it's grown really well.
So I'm personally loving this because my son grows veg.
We love those people, key workers. Yeah, fantastic.
But what I'm listening to with my Extinction Rebellion hat on is I'm listening all the time for things that we can do. So we really want to understand, you know, the complexities, but we also want to know what should we be pushing for and how should we be making a difference. So you know, that's always really helpful.
And what I like about the food stuff is it's not about saying we're doing less of stuff, because a lot of I'm a total climate person as well, so you know, I stopped flying years ago, you know, I don't have a car, all those things, they're all about doing less, and they're all a tiny bit miserable. That means I probably won't see a lot of wildlife around the world. But with food, there is gorgeous things to be done about relationship and to do with having connections with farms and to having connections with people who trade. One of my favourite moments in all the world is seeing the moment of trade in our organic farmers market locally in Stoke Newington, because it's the moment of human connection between work and exchange and all those really fundamentals about who we are and what we do. And what is also exchanged is a smile and a how's your family doing? And in that point, you know, fundamental nutrition is being exchanged as well, which is vegetables that are far better for you than some of the, you know, the wet salad that's in horrible plastic bags in supermarkets that, you know, was also grown by people who've had a really bad time. Out with the old and in with actually the even older, which is proper relationship with food.
Kath, you mentioned this group in Hackney, the not box scheme, veg
growing communities. Yeah.
If you could make sure that gets to Jane or something.
Yeah, I'll give you the blog as well, written by their wholesaler. Go on, there's your COVID reading. The wholesaler for growing communities, who wrote about this fundamental fair relationship with the farmers that also provides good jobs to the small scale farmers. It was one of my most important pieces of reading through the whole COVID thing. I've been doing quite a lot of negative stuff around COVID to do with food poverty, people running out of food, nagging the government to help out with free school meals. Yay for Marcus Rashford, who came in and won that campaign in the end, but we were suing the government at the same time over child hunger. I think the positive side is about the fact that loads more people contacted fruit and veg schemes. Loads more people signed up to box schemes. Of course, people who are a bit wealthier, so that's not actually feeding everybody. But at least it was that. I mean, you know, I'm very happy that some more money was going to those veg box schemes. But let's really support those. Let's make sure there is one in every conurbation. Let's make sure that those are based on really sound principles that support the kind of agroecological farming that the land needs and that the wildlife needs.
Perhaps the Chancellor should have provided vouchers to buy or to exchange for fruit and veg from veg box schemes instead of from
interesting
from a Monday to Wednesday.
So interestingly, in America, I mean, you don't often look to America for good food policy, but here we go, here's one, which is in America that people on low incomes can spend some of their food stamps, food vouchers, with farmers markets. I mean, farmers market means something slightly different in the States than here, but because they are tied to the farming, they're a kind of farm subsidy, but providing food at the same time to people on a low income. And that kind of smart diversion of public money into genuine public goods that support multiple outcomes like that is good stuff. I don't see our Chancellor really getting that.
No. You have to work harder on him.
Yeah, go on. No, Miles, you can do that.
So I'd love to move us on, because both of you have such a wide background. I would love to just move us on a little bit. And I wondered if it might be good to think about the different habitats. And I know, Miles, we were interested in talking about, where carbon is stored, and how the different, we have got a poll on that which we could put out, before you spill the beans, if you'd like. Would that be a helpful
do the
thing
poll? Do the poll. Let's
do
have
the
another
poll.
poll.
People like polls. So have a look at this poll. So in which habitat is most carbon stored in the UK, do you think? And you can all have a go at this one. Okay, let's have a look at the results.
Well, interesting. Bit of a split there. The correct answer is that peatlands, the majority, wasn't a 52-48. It was a strong majority of 58%. Recognise that peatlands are far and away our largest carbon store, with 3.2 billion tonnes of carbon. And coming up a not exactly distant second, Phil, have you got those links that I sent you? If you could stick those up in the chat, that would be great. 2 billion tonnes for UK's grasslands, and that partly reflects the large area that grasslands cover in this country. And then coming up in third is forestry, with about 1 billion tonnes. Arable is despite a very large area of arable land, it holds very little carbon.
Just for clarification, where we're looking at this, it's not, if I had the same amount of tree cover, land that covered tree cover, peatlands, pasture and arable, would the results still be the same, or is it skewed because of the amount of land?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, per hectare, peatlands still have the highest carbon store. And when you look at grassland versus forest cover, in terms of the soil carbon, it's more or less the same. The difference is in the vegetation. So obviously where you've got a growing crop of trees or where you've got a woodland, then the carbon in the trees is substantial. But of course, if those trees get chopped down and turned into something, or burnt in, or worst of all, burnt in a biomass power station, then that carbon is released again. So you can't really include that in the store. So it rather depends on how long you think a store lasts. I'm currently, yes, here we go. So there's a figure for you. Slightly unhelpfully, it's a different terminology that they've used in the report which I found this from. So open wetlands actually means peatlands, but anyway. And you can see that is far and away the largest. Now, pastures, improved grassland, semi-natural grassland, there really is almost no semi-natural grassland left in the UK. It was almost destroyed during the kind of period of the worst excesses of the Green Revolution from the 1940s to the 1980s. So there's only about 100,000 hectares of semi-natural grassland left in the UK. That's where all the wildlife is. So the improved grassland stores much less carbon in it, but because there's so much more improved grassland, that's where the carbon is.
So what does this mean then in terms of our food production, and what changes you would like to see, say, in land use or in agriculture? Or, I heard I know that Kath said something about mixed farming. Is that something that's important, or?
So the carbon stocks are relatively fixed, in as much as most of them are in these peatlands, and the best thing you can do with peatlands is not to put any farming anywhere near them, or indeed not to put any forestry anywhere near them. These are the vast blanket bogs of the north of Scotland, and there are also peatlands which have been very, very badly damaged. So, for example, the East Anglian fenlands, which are ironically some of our most productive farmland, are peatlands, and they've been very badly damaged to the point of destruction. Some argue that they should be restored to a wild state in order to try and hang on to what's left of the carbon store there. However, they are only literally 1 or 2 meters above sea level. So as we all know, the sea is going to rise and they are going to be inundated, at which point the carbon that's left in them will be protected under the sea. Elsewhere, though, there is certainly a lot we can do. So, for example, blanket bog in the uplands is currently grazed with sheep. We are fantastically self-sufficient in sheep. In fact, we're 110%. It sounds like something from Spinal Tap, but it is actually true. We are 110% self-sufficient in sheep because we produce more sheep than we eat. In fact, the numbers of people eating lamb and mutton are going down all the time, and yet we continue to produce more sheep. It's one of the most bizarre things of the whole of UK agriculture policy. So much money and effort is put into producing sheep, which many people in the UK no longer eat. That may well be something which changes as a result of leaving the EU, particularly if we leave without a deal. So the sheep will leave the peatlands, and the peatlands will be allowed to restore to a point where the carbon is protected, and actually they're drawing carbon down from the atmosphere. At the moment, they're releasing methane, they're damaged, they're drained, they're being overgrazed, they're being burnt on grass moors, they're having trees planted on them. So they are in a bit of a parlous state. So far and away, the most important thing we can do is to protect these peatlands, because that is our carbon store. That's where most of it is. When it comes to farmland, this is where it gets very contentious, because there's one group which argues that we should abandon all meat production, abandon all dairy production, and that will somehow remove a lot of carbon and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. On the other hand, you've got people saying, well, actually, grazing livestock on grassland helps to store carbon in the soil. The act of grazing pushes organic matter into the soil, as long as you're doing it in a very extensive way, without fertilizer, without pesticide, ideally with lots of different species within the grassland. That can be a carbon store. That can actually draw CO2 out of the atmosphere.
So I'd love to, we have got another poll that we could use at this point, if you were interested.
Yes.
Not that I want to butt in, but we did have a poll about what people eat. And I think it would be good to bring Kath in on this as well, because, you know, what we're eating and therefore what we're buying and what we're growing is going to make a difference.
Well, I'm always interested in the question about the what do you eat question, because it individualizes it, which is a real shame, because actually we need to be thinking about what we are demanding of the land. And I think that lends itself to a slightly different question or different responses. So as I said, well, let's combine with what Miles just said, actually. I think we should be much more aware of what our assets are in terms of land that is good for biodiversity and carbon. And we should treat that with sanctity and make sure that peatlands are no longer burnt, that they are not being used for inappropriate purposes, and so they're maximising their benefits for a very wide range of things, because it's also about water and it's also about our air and all sorts of things. So to be much more aware of those assets, so that the land managers are looking after those in the right way and getting in some way rewarded, because that rather points to the fact you're not going to get a crop off that land. And therefore, what is it for and how is it maintained is a big question. Then you get down to, well, the productive lands that we are using. There's a bit of a division in my world between the people who say keep the wildlife in the hedgerows and maximise the amount of food coming out of the field by using chemical inputs, fertilisers and those kind of things, or saying quid pro quo, we have a balanced approach to saying we're going to get a bit less food, but you're not going to destroy the pollinators in field. So it's broadly known as sparing and sharing. And I've done that a disservice. It's not my speciality in how I've described it, but are we sparing the land for wildlife, or are we sharing it with the wildlife? And that then impacts on the way we interact and the way we do the farming. Miles, correct me if that was an inappropriate way of
Perfect.
Oh, darling. So I am firmly of the belief that we should be moving into the sharing mode because of all the things I've read, which means agroecological production. So where we are trying to get a productive crop out of the land, I'm talking about food, not forestry here, although it can intersect as well, then we should be doing that in an agroecological way. And that does affect what we end up eating, because we don't just kick some livestock off the land and then import the rest of the livestock that we need, because that will have a hoof print somewhere else. So we're not trying to destroy rainforest at the same time as eating a bit of livestock. So I suspect that a balanced diet for the whole nation, within which people have some choices to make, would look like loads of plants and not very much livestock, to bring it down simply. And we also wouldn't waste very much. I mean, look at that, you know, between a third and a half of the food being wasted. It's insane. But again, I don't want to focus too much on that, because that rather gets us off the hook of what is being produced and how it's being produced. Everything we eat should be produced in a way that's agroecological. Otherwise, we're screwing over ecosystems. And that includes the fish at sea, and that includes the livestock here, and that includes the fruit and veg, and that includes the arable. When I see figures, Miles, with your arable figures there, it's kind of interesting, because I also know that even when we do eat 40% of that wheat, not of it will be going into processed foods. So it isn't necessarily even that good of food that it's being put into. Trouble is, that's quite profitable when you process arable crops within an inch of their lives, then they come out as quite unpleasant foods that aren't that good for your health either. So
it's not profitable for the farmer, though. I mean, that's one of the that's one of the places where the farmer gets the smallest proportion of the sale price, compared to veg or beef, where they might get up to half of the retail price. So I mean, it varies hugely.
It does. The economics of it's all rather skewed as well. I'm very influenced by my dear friend Andrew Whitley, who's the Real Bread campaign chap, and bread, brilliant man. Of course, when you grow a wheat crop, a lot of it gets processed into white flour, which he and I joke about it being pointless flour, but you know, obviously people do make choices. But in the processing to white, all the good stuff is taken out and then sold into the vitamins industry, so you can buy it back at £16 a jar. So the profitability goes into the vitamin industry, not to the wheat farmer. But that's the economics of food as well. The people who do the primary production don't get much of the pound, unless it's done in an ethical way, like my mate Julie from Growing Communities, who pushes the price up to the farmer to make sure they can make a living. And I think that's entirely where we need to be. It shouldn't all be subsidised back in from public purse. It should be built into the food price. Unfortunately, of course, that means food prices might go up a bit. So we have to look at income. Trouble with food system, you push down one thing, you have to work on something else. So if you're going to make sure farmers can make a living, food might not be dirt cheap, but at the moment it's dirt cheap, and I mean that in a quite a derogative kind of way, which means that people can't make a living throughout that supply chain. A bit secretly, as an XR supporter, I kind of think, well, then we'd have less money to spend on flying everywhere as well, which, you know, actually, is that such a loss? I'm living proof that it's possible not to fly, you know.
Yeah, Kath, as well, I know Vicky was going to talk about the role that food retail and manufacturing have in maintaining the current system and blocking change. I don't know if that's part of this thing that you're talking about at the moment, or if I...
Well, yes, I don't like to focus too much on individual consumer choice, because it tends to bring it down to quite parochial things and slightly finger pointing. Well, you eat this and you know, that's not the point. The point is, what do we buy as a nation? That sounds a bit pompous. I don't mean it like that. What I mean is, when a caterer makes a decision to buy 17 tons of fish, how was that produced? Or 400 tons of seasonal vegetables, and what kind of recipes do they then make? Because most of the food we eat isn't prepared by, well, different in this room, in this nice room of people, we probably do quite a lot of cooking, but a lot of people, including ourselves, will eat quite a lot of food prepared by others, whether that is a supermarket in a ready meal, or when you go to the pub having a meal, or when you're in hospital or in school, somebody is preparing your food for you. Therefore, they have made purchasing choices on your behalf to the multi-billion level. So we've worked over the last 10 years or so to get, for example, all caterers to commit to using only verifiably sustainable fish. I'm a bit of a fish obsessive. I won't go too much into fish because it's not your field, but because that it's like a gatekeeper to ecosystems. Like, you know, I say that sometimes to caterers and they go, what? and again, and so I try and modify my language. It's like, but you know, they have their pounds that they are spending have a direct impact on what is done at sea in marine ecosystems, and the same is true in farming, but far less obviously manifested in good purchasing decisions by really big players like the supermarkets, like the big brands, you know, the people, the processors, the Nestle's of this world. And not done by the catering industry, who have very low margins. So I think we should be making requirements on those to have to, because as gatekeepers, they have huge influence. Do we want to spend the rest of our lives and the rest of every single generation's life trying to persuade 64 million people in our country to make choices about sustainable fish that on which our marine ecosystems depend and our future supply of fish? Or do we just make it part of the way the market works? You do not buy unsustainable fish, you do not trade unfairly, and you do not push producers into penury for their production when they've got so much else to do. And I'm becoming more and more adamant about that with age. Hence, it's hard for caterers to have meetings with me without me banging the table these days. But I don't feel like I want each individual caterer to make that decision. Nor for Nestle to decide what the production standards are, nor for supermarkets to get to dictate.
Sorry, Kath, you're too late for stopping Nestle from deciding what the production standards are.
I know. Well, no, but they are. That's the trouble, isn't it? And they're going into private partnerships with government to define that on the basis of what's profitable, which is just outrageous.
It is. Nestle have actually set up their own independent agri-environment scheme, independent of the government. With the
Tesco,
government
as has Sainsbury's, as has Waitrose, and some of them have done it better than others. But why is there that disparity? You know, what's our policy on neoliberalism?
Splitting down into different, you know, into a fragmented system, presumably because there's general dissatisfaction with the official one.
Yeah.
So I could listen to you, I'm sure we could all listen to you talking all day, but I'm sure that what has happened is that lots of questions have been sparked in people's heads. Is there something that you would like to say before we give people a chance to ask some questions?
I'd actually love to hear from people. Okay.
Anything, Miles, that you feel that you know, there was one burning thing and that I've not let you say it?
Well, if there was one burning thing, it was methane.
Pun central.
Thank you very much.
Appearing all week.
I just wanted to say that there's a general view that livestock are a very significant contributor to the carbon footprint of food, and some relatively recent research is really undermining that position by pointing out that methane is an extremely short-lived greenhouse gas. Has a half-life of less than 10 years, and it needs to be looked at in a different way from the much longer-lived pollutants, carbon dioxide and particularly nitrous oxide, which is released when chemical fertilizers are used, which goes back to what Kath was saying about adopting agroecological approaches to food production, which doesn't use synthetic chemical fertilizer.
Well, of course, I'm sure you'd agree that livestock does have a gigantic footprint through the other things like its feed and nitrogen fertilizer.
And this is the difference between intensively produced livestock and extensively produced livestock. I'll give you a very, very quick example from near here, because I was thinking about it when you were talking about your veg box. In Dorset, we still have some of these fantastic wildlife habitats called lowland heathland, which are internationally important for their wildlife. And on one particular site, there is a herd of cattle. And they are very happy there, grazing, munching on the heather and other things there. But they do produce a few animals each year. And I have to say, this is the best beef I've ever tasted. And I know that the animals were very happy while they were alive, and they were helping to maintain an internationally important wildlife habitat. So as far as I'm concerned, you know, that's probably the best kind of meat that you can eat, if you're going to. Nobody's saying you should, but if you're going to, then do that rather than very, very intensively managed animals with a large carbon footprint.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So we would do a round of applause if we were in a room, but we're not. But what we're going to do now is Phil is at the ready to send everybody off into a room. So we're all going to go into a room for maybe about 5 minutes. You'll be with 4 or 5 other people. And what I'd like you to do in that room is to decide the one most important thing that you jointly would like to ask Miles or Kath. So because there's so many of us here, we're not going to be able to all ask a question, but you can all agree on the question that you would like to ask them. They're going to try and get through as many as you can, so you won't be in these groups for very long. And we will also try and give you some answers to them if they don't manage to cover them. So your work will not be in vain. Are you ready for this then, Phil? Yes. Great. So the deal is now you've discussed, I hope you've all agreed on one question that you're up for asking, or something approximating to that. No cheating, no putting more than one question in. Please put your question into the chat. Let's just start off with the first one that's come in. Well done, Charlie, for being so quick. How can we use more emotion in our campaigning around food? I don't know if Kath or Miles wants to start with that.
I love that question. I think it absolutely needs it. Nobody makes decisions based on rationality or numbers or graphs. They base it on emotion first. That provides the motive. I mean, you know, the technical description, but I know that in my heart as well. It has worked to talk to catering managers about their personal impact on marine conservation. We managed to get the main wholesaler of fish in this country to change their buying policy towards sustainable fish, not by talking about profitability or business rates or any of those things that my training in the environment movement had told me, and talking about, you know, framing it from a business perspective. I talked to him as a human being. And we got quite emotional. We were at the London aquarium where there's lots of fish swimming around, literally swimming around your heads because there's sharks swimming on either side of you. You can't talk about conserving marine conservation while standing beside a real shark without having some emotion. And it was beautiful, and we're mates now. And I think friendship, love, passion, but authenticity as well. So not designing that conversation, that was because it was the right place to have the conversation, and it really influenced me about how we go about a lot of this stuff. I have to sort of time it quite well. When we induct members of staff at Sustain, I'm kind of trying to judge the right moment to bring in the whole love thing, because it can be quite scary for people to start talking in that kind of way. But I hope you gather from the way I talk here that authenticity matters as well. I have not designed a conversation with you guys. Lovely Charlie Hicks just has asked this question about emotion. I'm looking at you as a human being right now and saying, what is it that we can do together that will change the problems that we're facing? And we do have power in our hands. We live in a wealthy nation, and that influences a lot of the way the world works, and we listen to people internationally, and we share ideas. And if love can't get us through this one, God knows what will. Because, you know, but also a bit of, what other emotions have I had recently? Quite a lot of anger, I think. Also,
anger, yeah.
Anger is actually really, when it's directed properly, if you direct anger in on yourself, you get depression. If you direct anger out to the world in a way that is about creating change, then you focus on what should change, and it can drive you. So, as I said, I mentioned rather jokingly earlier that we'd taken the government to court during COVID over child hunger. God, it was fun. I can tell you as a group, because hanging out with lawyers who are morally driven to do something good, to be around intellects who are prepared to apply that intellect to how do you hold our elected representatives to account for child hunger, was very good fun. But it was a very driven fun, and there was a lot of laughter. We had Zoom meetings right till 2 a.m. sometimes to try and work out the technical detail of what we were going to write in our pre-litigation letters. And Marcus Rashford just won in the end, bless him, what a wonderful man. But he was authentic as well. He talked about just human experience. The human experience of what we are facing as a species at the moment needs to be shared. I love XR for this as well. Let's just, first of all, just acknowledge it, then say, as human beings, what can we do together?
So I'm desperately looking for overlaps in the questions, and they're all so diverse here, which is brilliant. I mean, we have such a wonderful group here. I wonder if we could look at the idea of a just transition. How could we get a just transition? I'm just looking for that question again. If anyone can see it on the, how can we ensure a just transition to a better system involving a collaborative and relational approach which takes account of the needs and difficulties of farmers?
We have to take farmers with us. We can't be against them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think increasingly farmers are realising themselves that they can contribute, particularly in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation. There was a figure, actually, I don't know if you've got it, Phil, looking at the UK carbon footprint for food, emissions associated with UK food consumption. Can you stick that one up? The UK agriculture system is not a massive contributor to the total UK carbon footprint, but as I said earlier, changing the way that the land is used can help to sequester lots of carbon from the atmosphere, and farmers need to be, and farmers are recognising that, and there's all sorts of new initiatives cropping up, encouraging farmers to look at the amount of carbon that they have on their farms, and also looking at the way that they produce food and the way that production systems either help to sequester carbon or to release it. So I think XR can encourage that shift, which is already happening, by supporting those farmers who are making the change, and using your buying power as well. But I think perhaps more by highlighting. Oh, there it is. Well done. Highlighting what is already happening. I mean, I think if you look at this graphic, you can see that actually quite a lot of the UK's, can you get rid of that? That's it, brilliant. Quite a lot of the UK's greenhouse gas footprint from food comes from abroad. So there isn't a huge amount we can do about that from here, other than changing the choices that we make in the food that we buy. But if you see, for example, dairy is a relatively small amount. So getting rid of dairy would not make a huge difference to the overall. I mean, all of this is only something like 7% of the UK carbon footprint. So it's not massive. But XR can certainly encourage that shift to perhaps accelerate. And so we're looking at ways of farming which help to store carbon, and looking at ways of farming which emits fewer greenhouse gases, like, for example, nitrous oxide that I was talking about, and methane to a lesser extent.
Yeah, and I think sorry, yes, Kath, go on.
No, so I didn't mean to jump on you. Because I was looking down the questions and I was thinking some of them tie together rather beautifully.
Lovely, thank you.
That narrative of the kind of that I was using before about the gatekeepers. So somebody's asked about local authorities, farmers, etc., but also access to land. And there are literal gates on a lot of land. So who are the gatekeepers to that? And I think local authorities are particularly interesting at the moment, because, I mean, yeah, they're on their knees in terms of finance, and I rather fear there's going to be a fire sale of land and assets because they won't be able to meet their other statutory requirements. So it's going to be messy over the next few years, but I'm also thinking about how could we make sure that doesn't go awry. So we're working with some local authorities about what would a sustainable land use strategy look like for a local authority, either at city, rural area, district, parish, county level. And I think that the energy is sitting there. There are people who manage large portfolios of land, both for farming, forestry, for the verges on motorways and roads and all those sorts of things. So how that is managed is within our ability to influence in a way far better at some ways than some of the national stuff. I do a lot of work on national policy, so I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on that. But the local authorities, I think, are really quite interesting because they want to make a mark. And I think, they're doing it right now, beginning to decide how many trees to plant, where to plant them, how to manage that land. But are they requiring the farmers on their county farmland, for example, to farm agroecologically? And are they organising the communities within the towns and cities nearby to organise themselves well to buy that produce in a way that's fair and they can make a livelihood from it? So once again, replicating some of the things that are happening in pockets in good places around the country. And that also allows for access to land. So like your son, Talia, who you mentioned before, people who are keen on right-size horticulture and nearer to conurbation so that we don't have to transport it and lose loads of it, and a good ready access to the market, and providing jobs that are compatible with family life, means that land around urban and conurbation areas could be more devoted to small-scale horticulture production, so that has got ready routes to market. It's the way cities actually grew up. They had a horticultural belt around them because transporting perishable produce a long way requires lots of refrigeration, and there's lots of losses and all those things. But if we could make good jobs of a bit more land, it doesn't have to be all that much. We were trying to work out just in London, for example, I don't want to be too London-centric, but about how much land it would be, and we reckoned it would be about 5 hectares per outer London borough to supply quite a large proportion of the 5 a day. We're trying to hook it to public health policy as well, so that people are driven to do it. So it wasn't actually all that scary an amount, but you can imagine supporting that amount of land and that amount of jobs, and getting some, local authority money and some, say, lottery money in to help with people who've been long-term unemployed to get jobs in it, and it starts becoming really feasible for an individual community to start doing it and making it happen. And then you get people like Julie along, who is my mate who runs, sorry to go on about growing communities again, but she now runs a wholesaler in East London that is supplying all of the veg boxes in London. And so to start aggregating that demand in a really sensible way, so it becomes an economy of scale without pushing down the prices to the producers, and also supplying fresh produce into the city. She's now trying to make it work for low-income consumers as well. We could get really savvy about this, and if we can't get savvy about it, then we're going to let Tesco and Nestle dictate the standards.
And I know that we had, I'm not sure if, I haven't been able to check obviously through who's actually on the call, but I know that we had some of our local council, Oxfordshire councillors who signed up to come to this, and will obviously be able to see the recording later if they would like to. The other thing I just wanted to say, when you were talking about working with farmers, Miles, is that we did have a really lovely time, I think, as Oxford XR, when we had the Real Farming Conference and the Ordinary Farming Conference here in Oxford last year. And I think we had some very good feedback from the traditional farmers who are definitely wanting to move in the right direction. And I think the way that we had dialogue was very positive. We're not going to have time for very many more questions, but I think one that seems to be coming up to me, and I hope I'm not being biased here, is what demands can XR make? What should we be? If you were planning a campaign, if you were going to advise us, what would be your top 3 things that we should focus on?
I think the top one is where we started, which is, why the hell are we only producing 35% of the fruit and vegetables that we consume? As Kath just said, it doesn't take up a lot of land, it employs a lot of people, and it produces a high quality, high value product. So why are we not doing that? So that's the first one, I think. Kath, do you want to?
I think I'd go for some national stuff and some local stuff. So the national things are, I run an alliance. I don't run an NGO, I run an alliance of NGOs. So it's our job to get together and work out collectively what are the most important things to achieve together. So I would say this, obviously wouldn't I, but Vicky is the coordinator of these things and has fantastically got together some really key asks around our new UK agriculture policy post-European Union. And that has to happen. We have to have money going to agroecological production, and at the moment agroecology is not included in the new legislation for UK farming, and we have to have money being directed to supporting that transition and in a fair way. So there are fairness things built into the new UK legislation as well. Unfortunately, they're done so in a way where the government doesn't have to do it. They are encouraged to do it, which is Weasley ways of writing legislation, but there we are. Welcome to the world of the technical detail.
Yeah.
But supporting that kind of the big movements that are saying what are the key things, and that's why being an alliance to me is really important, is to say we've sorted out together what we consider to be important collectively, and we're saying really can we bang that to MPs to make sure that gets really forced through. Not forced through, but encouraged through, helped through, and more people understanding it. We're going to be trying to do over the next year or so ways of interpreting that national picture down to constituency level so that people can make sense of it for their land use strategies locally as well, to say what are the assets we have locally, what are the things we should be protecting, what kind of land should we be making available for community supported agriculture, for community growing, for small scale horticulturalists, and then also who's going to step up to run some of these better trading schemes, better food trading. That's a phrase that we're using more and more, better food trading that would actually support right livelihoods on the land in a way where the produce is being supported loyally and well. And I think helping to build that systemic approach would be wonderful. So, you know, there might be one person on this call who would like to actually run one of those schemes or be part of the steering group that helps set them up, who knows. But to find the horticulturists who want to do it as well, but not make them not have to be generalists, make them just have to specialise in being agroecological producers, and we'll do the marketing and distribution for you because you don't have to be everything all at once. And there are lots of wonderful groups all over the country who are local food partnerships. We run a network called the Sustainable Food Cities Alliance, which is about, it's not just cities, we started with that, it's now called Sustainable Food Places. And it's about local people getting together with their local authority and with civil society and with people who might have some ability to make decisions about things like land, to try and work out what to do locally. And they can achieve some really good things together to push in this direction. So getting involved at the right sort of level that suits who you are and what you want to do, but really choosing one element of that and then going for it. Not trying to be everything, but trying to go for an element of it and saying, let's make that happen. And there's nothing like starting to do something than to attract people to go, I'd like to be part of that, actually. I'd like to be the person who gets up and drives the vegetables. I'd like to be the person who wants to buy into that. Oh, actually, I'm quite good at finance, so I could help you to run the scheme. You know, it's like making the change happen bit by bit and attracting people in to be part of a movement towards change.
Brilliant. On that note, did you want a final word, Miles? Because I think we need to wrap up.
Yes. All I was going to say was, if you wanted a controversial XR campaign, how about a campaign against cheap food? Because cheap food is a myth. If you're buying food that's very cheap at the till, it means that other people are paying for it elsewhere in the system. So for a long time, you know, the policy has been, let's produce food as cheap as possible. But actually, this is a very, very big part of the problem.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And obviously we've been looking at that with fashion and the same kind of thing, isn't it, really? It remains for me to say, if you are not involved with Extinction Rebellion, there are going to be some introduction to Extinction Rebellion for Oxford people, and I'm hoping that Phil will be able to put that link into the chat, but we will be emailing you anyway, as you know. An enormous thank you to Kath and to Miles for so much to tell us, so, you know, speaking off the hoof, you know, responding to whatever we asked them, and to being up for anything. That was really wonderful. A great thank you to Phil, who has been manically, you know, doing stuff in the background there, and that has been so helpful. And an enormous thank you, and an even bigger thank you for Jane King, who is sitting there. You think she's not doing anything, but she's actually brought the whole thing together, and it would not have happened without Jane. So thank you, everybody. What I would just like to say is, before you think of your next thing for this evening, before you go off, what one thing are you going to do as a result of today? Are you going to tell someone a fact that you heard? Are you going to sign up to go to the introduction to Extinction Rebellion? Have you got an idea that you want to put together? Are you going to change how you eat? Are you going to befriend your local farmer? What one thing are you going to do? And I'm challenging you to write that down for yourself, and maybe share it with someone. If you write it down, that'll help. If you tell someone, that'll help a little bit more. And thank you so much for coming.